So this lesson covers some ways that you can practice your major scales. And this is for my ebook, but you can learn from this video lesson for free and just watch the video and get some tips on practicing major scales. This comes from my major scale book for beginners to intermediates, which kind of gives students a solid foundation and introduction to major scales, to specifically major scales on the guitar. So we're going to go over some technical ways to practice scales, so like different combinations of fingerings and a couple of different tips. But we'll also go over some rhythmic divisions and variations and on how to practice your scales. Also a little bit of a talk about using a metronome and some talk about articulation and dynamics. So different ways of practicing your scales so that you're not mindlessly just practicing patterns over and over without thinking of how you can improve your music with scales. So part of learning scales, of course, is music theory, understanding key signatures on the guitar. But another point is we use them for technique often, right? To prepare our hands for what will happen in all pieces of music. So being diverse in your practice session will help you be prepared for the musical world. So let's start by I'll give you a few tips, some just general tips on practicing scales. First thing, I would always say the note names out loud. It's so easy on guitar to just memorize fingerings. You know, we just latch onto the fingering, we just memorize it super quick, and then we don't think about the notes at all. Especially when we're doing like closed scales and we learned it with diagrams or tab or something. So it's a really good idea to say the note names out loud. It's pretty easy if you know the first position scale. It's the same notes always, right? C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And that's one octave, right? From there to there. So you can always practice your scales just from one octave to the next. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And then C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. If you say it out loud, even if you're not making a huge connection with it, you're engaging with it on some level. So that's really important. I would also say the fingerings out loud. If you're trying to do I am fingering, I am, say it out loud. If you say it in your head, it could get jarbled, all garbled up with other things you're thinking about. Say it out loud. It makes it real. It makes it concrete. Recognize one octave patterns when you're playing two octave scales. So like I was just demonstrating there, there's one octave, and then practice from that second octave. So that you know that that's a one octave scale there. You might be playing a scale like this, but you should understand that C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So that's one octave. There's the next octave. You want to recognize the different octaves because when you're playing music, you rarely get a full scale. You'll just get little snippets of scales, like as part of a melody or something like that. So you want to recognize what those notes are. Also, when you're reading music, sometimes you jump into a different place and you just want to recognize like, oh, hey, this music here uses this pattern. So I know it just uses these notes because we're in C major. Okay, let's go over some right hand ways to practice your scales with right hand technique. First thing, you should practice rest strokes and free strokes. So a rest stroke is when you rest on the string below. Free stroke is when your fingers go in towards your palm and bypass that string, right? You should be practicing with both rest stroke and free stroke. No matter what combination we're talking about, always practice with both. Alternating fingers. Hugely important. I am. Never repeating a finger. Never repeating one. It's just like walking. You don't want to hop on one leg. You walk with one leg, then the next. So some combinations to go over are like I am, or the reverse, M-I. You could also do M-A, or the reverse A-M. You could also do three-fingered scales, or you could do I-A as well, of course. But you could do three-fingered scales like A-M-I, 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 A-M, that's more advanced though. So for this book, I've only recommended IM and MA. Later on, you could consider trying some three-fingered scales. Accenting groups is incredibly important and can help you keep track of alternation as well. So accenting in groups of two, IM. If you say the fingering out loud, like I just started doing, it can keep track because if the accent's on I, you should notice when you're not playing I and you accidentally played M. So groups of two, groups of three. I love groups of three. It means the accent is on a different finger each time. I, M, I, M, I, M. I, M, I, M, I, M. It's really diverse and it makes you very versatile being able to accent whatever finger is on the third note, right? It's pretty, I mean, it's I and then it's M. But so those are some solid ways, and of course there's larger groups. There's groups of four. There's groups of five. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's groups of six. There's groups of seven, etc., etc. Now, you should be able to play your scales just in a basic, solid, straight way with a controlled, even sound, full tone. But remember that music is diverse, and so you can also practice your scales with in different ways. So different rhythmic divisions. Sometimes when you're doing a shift, some patterns like short long, for example, might put the shift in an awkward place. So you can see that it made the shift really hard because it was in that small rhythmic division. That's good practice though. It can make you improve your shifts beyond what you might otherwise need to do. And there's tons of different rhythmic combinations, right? There's tons of different combinations that you can practice with just to be diverse. Don't forget as well that you can articulate or use dynamics as well. So you could do legato scales. Sorry. You could do staccato scales. You could do dynamics. So you could crescendo to the top note. You could do one long crescendo. You could, there's lots of different ones that you could do. Music is very freaky. The composers write whatever they want and you have to play it on guitar. So being versatile is the key here. I think that's enough for the beginner to intermediate level. There's a lot more we could talk about for advanced students or late intermediate to advanced. But I think that one of the reasons I created this particular book was to give beginner to intermediate students one book with only major scales in it and try to give them a foundation in that. Sometimes we buy these big books that have just so much stuff, major scales, minor scales, all the different types of minor scales, and just so much information. But this book just kind of gets you going. You start playing. There's diagrams in some of the areas. There's tab and notation and fingering. It just gets you playing scales. And then after you're done the book and you feel confident with that, you can move on to something like Aaron Shearer's Scale Supplement book, which is like 279 pages of melodic sight reading using scale patterns. That is excellent practice, but it's pretty daunting for beginners. It's pretty over the top. When I started playing the Shearer book, I'd already gone to I'd done a little bit of jazz school, also lots of classical. I'm mainly a classical guitarist, but I also went to jazz school, so for a little while. So I did lots of scale patterns. I knew my scale patterns already. I was really comfortable with key signatures on the guitar. So going through that was like a practice reading and just a very comprehensive study. But I think for beginners to intermediate students, that sheer book is like, it's just too much. So I hope that my book will just give you a foundation for whatever book that you decide to follow it up with, or whatever study or style you decide to follow it up with.